Optica's role was not limited to aerial photography and patrolling. It was capable of carrying out missions typical of helicopters but with the economy and range of an airplane.
I've seen plenty of planes, but some of the tiny aircraft out there look like they shouldn't even be able to get off the ground. From ridiculously small jets to homemade flying contraptions that somehow work, these machines push the limits of aviation in the weirdest ways.
There is only one plane large enough, strong enough, and most importantly, wide enough to handle the job when NASA has to transport its massive spaceship components.
Some are impressive, some are downright questionable, but they all have one thing in common. They'll make you wonder how on earth they actually fly. Starting with one older than most countries, Nemeth Parasol. Most planes stick to the same basic shape, wings on the sides, tail in the back, everything nice and predictable. But in 1934, a group of students at Miami University decided to throw all of that out the window and build something completely different. They created the Nemeth Parasol, a plane with a giant circular wing. Yeah, a flying saucer before flying saucers was even a thing. The whole idea was to prove that a round wing could actually work, and surprisingly, it did. The Nemeth Parasol didn't just get off the ground, it flew decently well. The design gave it insane lift, which meant it could stay airborne at lower speeds, and if things went wrong, it would gently float down like a parachute instead of crashing nose first into the ground. That was the theory at least. It looked like someone stuck a normal plane body underneath a flying donut. The engine was mounted up front, with the propeller pulling it forward, and the pilot sat in an open cockpit underneath that massive circular wing. It wasn't built for speed, and it definitely wasn't breaking any altitude records, but it proved that a round-wing aircraft wasn't just some ridiculous fantasy. Test flights showed that the Parasol could take off, fly, and land safely. Pilots said it handled well, though turning was a little weird compared to traditional planes. But here's the thing, no one really knew what to do with it. Sure, it worked, but there wasn't a clear reason to mass produce it. So, like a lot of experimental aircraft, it ended up as more of a small, weird concept than a game changer. And just like that, the Nemeth Parasol faded into history. It didn't revolutionize aviation, but it did prove something important, that sometimes the craziest ideas actually work. If things had gone differently, maybe we'd be flying around in round-winged aircraft today, or one that looked like a fly, the Edgeley Optica GBOPO. Most planes are built for speed, efficiency, or firepower, but this one was built for one thing only: visibility. Designed in the 1970s, this British aircraft looked like someone fused a fly with a helicopter and a spaceship. Its cockpit was a giant bubble, giving pilots an almost unrestricted 270-degree view of the world below. If you needed to survey land, track wildlife, or do any kind of aerial observation, this was the plane for the job. The Optica wasn't about breaking speed records. In fact, it was intentionally slow. With a cruising speed of just 81 miles per hour, it was meant to replace helicopters for surveillance work, but at a fraction of the cost. Its ducted fan engine, mounted behind the cockpit, made it quieter than most small planes, another bonus for reconnaissance. And since it had long, fixed wings instead of rotors, it was much easier to maintain than a helicopter. But for all its promise, the Optica ran into disaster. Literally. In 1985, one of the first production models crashed. The pilot and passenger didn't survive. A mechanical failure wasn't to blame, just bad luck and poor flying conditions. Unfortunately, the accident cast a shadow over the project and production slowed down. Then, another setback. In 1987, a factory fire destroyed most of the existing Optica aircraft. For a plane that was already struggling to gain traction, this was a brutal hit. Only a handful of Opticas were ever built, and the dream of replacing helicopters never quite materialized. Despite all this, the Optica never fully disappeared. A few still fly today, and there's always talk of reviving the design. After all, its concept still makes sense. It's an affordable, low-speed surveillance aircraft with unmatched visibility. Maybe in the right hands, the Optica could finally get the second chance it deserves. But Burt Rutan's Boomerang had that, but its weirdness didn't let it take off. Most planes are built keeping symmetry in mind, but Burt Rutan's Boomerang isn't like the other girls. Designed in the 1990s, 1950s, this odd-looking aircraft had an asymmetrical twin fuselage layout that made it look more like a rejected sci-fi prop than something meant for the skies, but there was a method behind the madness. Well, kind of. Rutan, known for pushing boundaries in aviation, built the Boomerang to solve a critical problem in twin-engine planes: losing control if one engine fails. Traditional twin-engine aircraft are designed symmetrically, which means if one engine fails, the remaining engine can pull the plane into a dangerous spin. The Boomerang's unique shape completely eliminated that risk. By offsetting the engines and fuselages, the aircraft could still fly safely even if one engine quit mid-flight. The result was a safer, more efficient multi-engine plane that handled better than most of its conventional counterparts. Performance-wise, the Boomerang wasn't just about safety, it was fast. Powered by a 210 horsepower Lycoming engine on one side and a 200 horsepower version on the other, it could cruise at around 260 miles per hour, significantly faster than similar aircraft of its size. Despite its unconventional look, it was incredibly aerodynamic, allowing it to fly farther on less fuel. But as with many of Rutan's experimental designs, the Boomerang never went into mass production. Even though it was a great plane, it was just too weird looking for anyone to really put their faith into. It remained a one-of-a-kind aircraft, admired for its engineering brilliance, but too unconventional for mainstream aviation. It still exists today, occasionally making appearances at air shows, where it continues to turn heads, but nothing compared to how it was to whip out the Goodyear inflatoplane out of your bag. Yup, your bag. The Goodyear inflatoplane could be inflated like a pool toy. But in the 1950s, Goodyear actually built it, believing it could be the ultimate lightweight rescue aircraft. The idea was simple. Soldiers could store it in a small container, inflate it with an air pump in minutes, and fly it out of danger. No runways, no heavy equipment, just a tough, rubberized aircraft that could be quickly deployed for on-the-go needs. On paper, it seemed brilliant. The GA-33 model had an airframe made almost entirely of rubber-coated fabric, with only a few metal parts for the engine, control surfaces, and landing gear. When fully inflated, it had a 22-foot wingspan and weighed just 240 pounds. A tiny two-stroke engine gave it enough power to take off, cruise at around 60 miles per hour, and stay in the air for about 6 hours. It could even carry a passenger if necessary. The reality, however, was less promising. While the inflatoplane did fly, it wasn't exactly built for combat or real-world conditions. A single bullet, sharp object, or even a rough landing could spell disaster. It was also difficult to control in bad weather, making it impractical for serious missions. The US Army tested it for potential search and rescue operations, but they quickly realized it wasn't reliable enough for actual deployment. By 1973, the project was officially scrapped. The concept was creative and the aircraft did work, but the risks far outweighed the benefits. Still, it remains one of the strangest aviation experiments ever attempted. A fully functional airplane made mostly of air. But nothing can come close to the Caproni CA-60. This isn't a tiny aircraft, but it hardly gets weirder than it. The Caproni was an aircraft so bizarre that it looked like someone had taken 3 planes, stacked them on top of each other, and hoped for the best. Designed by Italian engineer Gianni Caproni in 1921, this monstrous flying boat was meant to be the world's first transatlantic airliner, capable of carrying 100 passengers across the ocean. Instead, it became one of the strangest failures in aviation history, crashing on its very first flight. The plane itself was a nightmare of over-engineering. It had 3 sets of triple wings, giving it a total of 9 wings towering over its massive fuselage. With a wingspan of 98 feet and 8 engines mounted on the body, it was more of a floating apartment complex than an aircraft. The idea was that its sheer size and lift would allow it to cross the Atlantic in an era when long-distance air travel was still a fantasy. But while Caproni was a brilliant engineer, this design was more wishful thinking than solid aerodynamics. The first test flight took place over Italy's Lake Maggiore on March 4, 1921. As the giant contraption taxied across the water, it actually managed to take off, climbing to about 60 feet in the air. But almost immediately, it became clear that this thing was barely controllable. The aircraft wobbled in the sky for a few moments before slamming back into the lake, breaking apart on impact. The wreckage was recoverable, and Caproni had every intention of fixing it up for another attempt. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. Before repairs could begin, a mysterious fire broke out and destroyed what was left of the aircraft. Whether it was sabotage, an accident, or just the universe's way of saying, this was a terrible idea, the Caproni CA-60 was done for good. And if something could come close to the strangeness here, it's the Pregnant Guppy. The Pregnant Guppy was one of the strangest-looking aircraft to ever take to the skies, but it played a critical role in NASA's Apollo program. Built in the 1960s, this oversized cargo plane was designed specifically to haul massive rocket components that would have otherwise taken weeks to transport by land or sea. Without it, getting parts for the Saturn V rocket from California to Florida would have been a logistical nightmare. The aircraft itself was a Frankenstein's monster of aviation. It started as a modified Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, a passenger plane from the 1940s, but with some major and ridiculous alterations. Engineers stretched the fuselage and then added a massive, bulbous cargo hold that looked like the aircraft had swallowed another plane whole. This bizarre design earned it the name Pregnant Guppy, and while it wasn't exactly graceful, it got the job done. The real challenge was making sure it could actually fly. The added weight and awkward shape could have easily made it unstable, but engineers reinforced the structure and adjusted the wings and tail to compensate. Surprisingly, it worked. The Pregnant Guppy first took flight in 1962, proving that it could carry enormous payloads while still being maneuverable enough to land safely. NASA quickly put it to use, transporting large sections of the Apollo rockets from the West Coast to Kennedy Space Center in a fraction of the time traditional shipping methods would have taken. Before the Guppy, moving these parts meant long, complicated trips through the Panama Canal or across the country by rail. With this aircraft, NASA could get crucial components where they needed to be in hours instead of weeks. Despite its ridiculous appearance, the Pregnant Guppy was a huge success. It was eventually replaced by even larger versions, like the Super Guppy, which continued the job for decades. But the original will always be remembered as the oddly shaped plane that helped send astronauts to the moon. It wasn't pretty, but when it came to making history, looks didn't matter. Just like the Curtiss-Wright VZ-7, the aircraft was supposed to be the future of battlefield mobility, an airborne jeep that could hover, maneuver in tight spaces, and give soldiers a new way to move across rough terrain. Instead, it ended up as yet another military experiment that looked great on paper but didn't quite work in practice. Developed in the late 1950s for the US, the VZ-7 was part of a wave of experimental aircraft designed to test vertical takeoff and landing capabilities. The idea was simple: create a lightweight, easy-to-fly machine that could lift off like a helicopter but handle more like a ground vehicle. Curtiss-Wright's approach involved a boxy metal platform with 4 ducted fans mounted underneath. The pilot sat exposed on top, controlling the machine with a basic joystick and throttle. On the ground, the VZ-7 looked interesting. It was an oversized drone with a seat slapped on top. In the air, it was another story. It could take off vertically and hover, but stability was a major issue. The aircraft relied entirely on its fans for lift, meaning that if anything went wrong, there were no wings or backup systems to keep it from dropping like a rock. Pilots found it difficult to control, and despite multiple design tweaks, the Army wasn't convinced it was practical for the battlefield. One of the biggest problems was speed, or rather, the lack of it. The VZ-7 could lift off and hover, but it struggled to move forward efficiently. Unlike helicopters, which could tilt their rotors for forward thrust, the VZ-7 relied on its ducted fans, making it sluggish and difficult to maneuver. For a military vehicle meant to replace ground transport, that was a deal-breaker. By 1960, the Army had seen enough. The program was cancelled, and the few prototypes were handed over to NASA and other research agencies for further study. The VZ-7 never made it to the battlefield, but it was still one of the most unconventional aircraft to ever exist. But that's nothing compared to the Delackner HZ-1 Aerocycle. The Delackner HZ-1 Aerocycle was supposed to turn soldiers helicopters into airborne scouts, soaring over battlefields like they are riding a bicycle. Instead, it became a perfect example of why not every seemingly good idea should make it past the prototype stage. Developed in the 1950s for the US, the Aerocycle was a personal helicopter meant to be operated with minimal training. The design was as simple as it was ambitious, just a single-person platform with a massive downward-facing rotor underneath. The soldier would stand on top, gripping motorcycle-style handlebars, and control the craft by shifting their body weight. In theory, it was supposed to be easy enough for any infantryman to use after just a few hours of instruction. Reality, however, was far less forgiving. The Aerocycle was difficult to balance, and maneuvering it required an unnatural level of precision. The rotor spun just inches below the pilot's boots, meaning a single misstep could lead to serious injury or worse. Safety concerns quickly became apparent as test flights revealed just how unstable the machine was. The slightest shift in weight could send it into an uncontrollable wobble, and without any real protection for the pilot, crashes were inevitable. Despite multiple design tweaks, the Aerocycle never became stable enough for practical use. The Army wanted a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle, but soldiers were understandably hesitant to fly something that felt like balancing on a spinning saw blade. The few pilots who tested it quickly realized it was nearly impossible to control in real-world conditions, and after a handful of crashes, the project was scrapped entirely. By 1958, the Aerocycle was officially abandoned, with the Army concluding that it simply wasn't safe. While it never saw combat, it's quite crazy to think about the fact that it existed in the first place, but at least this one looked like a plane. Snecma Coleoptere C-450 looked questionable. The Snecma C-450 Coleoptere was supposed to be France's answer to the future of aviation, an aircraft that could take off and land vertically, eliminating the need for runways. Instead, it ended up being a glorified metal ring with a jet engine that proved nearly impossible to control. Designed in the 1950s, the Coleoptere looked more like a flying canister than a plane. Its entire structure was built around a massive circular wing, with the pilot crammed into a tiny cockpit at the top. The idea was ambitious. It would lift off like a rocket, hover in midair, then smoothly transition into horizontal flight like a jet. In theory, it could take off from anywhere, land in tight spaces, and offer military forces a new level of flexibility they never really had before. But there was just one problem flying. This thing was a complete nightmare. Unlike helicopters, which have rotors to maintain stability, the Coleoptere relied on small directional jets and the pilot's nerves of steel. Keeping it balanced was like trying to stand a pencil on its eraser. Even slight overcorrections could send it into a wobbling disaster. Test flights were tense, with pilots carefully hovering just a few feet above the ground, hoping the machine wouldn't tip over. Then came the ninth and final flight. On July 25, 1959, test pilot Auguste Morel took the Coleoptere up for what was supposed to be a routine hover test. But as he tried to bring it back down, things spiraled. Literally, the aircraft lost stability and started tumbling uncontrollably. Morel had only one option: eject. He launched himself out just in time, becoming one of the first pilots to bail from a VTOL aircraft. Meanwhile, the Coleoptere met its fate, crashing violently and turning into a pile of expensive scrap. That was the end of the Coleoptere experiment. The project was scrapped, and France moved on to more practical aircraft. But for a brief moment in aviation history, someone really thought this flying tin would revolutionize air travel. Instead, it just proved how tricky vertical takeoff really is. And well, while that might sound like the limit to how insane things can get here, the steeper Caproni will really test your expectations. This one looked less like an aircraft and more like someone had jammed a plane inside a giant metal tube. Designed in 1932 by Italian aeronautical engineer Luigi Stipa, this bizarre experimental aircraft took conventional design and threw it out the window. Instead of a sleek fuselage, it had a thick, barrel-shaped body that housed the engine and propeller inside, essentially making it one big flying duct. Stipa called this concept an in-tubed propeller, believing it would improve efficiency by directing airflow more effectively. In theory, the enclosed propeller would create more thrust while reducing drag. To test the idea, the Italian government gave the go-ahead to build a prototype, and Caproni, an Italian aircraft manufacturer, took on the challenge. What they came up with was a stubby, chubby aircraft that looked more like a giant vacuum cleaner than something meant to fly. Despite its odd appearance, the steeper Caproni actually worked. During test flights, it proved to be surprisingly stable, with smooth handling and a soft landing. The problem was that it was slow, painfully slow. While the ducted design increased airflow efficiency, it also created a lot of extra weight and drag, limiting its speed and overall performance. The Italian Air Force, which had originally been interested in the project, took one look at the sluggish performance and walked away. Although the steeper Caproni never made it into production, it wasn't a complete failure. The in-tubed propeller concept later influenced the development of jet engines, particularly in how air is directed through modern turbofans. But just because something works doesn't mean it's practical. That was exactly the case with Vought V173 Flying Pancake. Better known as the Flying Pancake, this aircraft was designed during World War II. It was the US Navy's attempt to create a fighter that could take off and land in extremely tight spaces, ideal for aircraft carriers. Instead of a traditional fuselage with wings, the entire plane was essentially one big disc-shaped wing. It was weird, but it actually worked. The brain behind this unusual design was Charles Zimmerman, an aeronautical engineer who believed that a flat, blended wing aircraft would offer exceptional lift, allowing it to take off at very low speeds. This would be perfect for naval operations, where runway space was limited. The V173 had a lightweight wooden frame, two massive propellers, and a bubble canopy perched awkwardly in the middle. It looked strange, but when test flights began in 1942, pilots were surprised at how stable and controllable it was. The Flying Pancake could take off in as little as 200 feet, a huge advantage for carrier-based planes. It also had an impressive ability to hover at low speeds without stalling. Test pilots, including the legendary Charles Lindbergh, praised its handling, and the Navy was optimistic about its potential. However, as promising as the V173 was, it was just a stepping stone to a more advanced version, the XF-5U1. This new model was larger, heavier, and made of metal instead of wood. It was meant to be a high-speed fighter capable of reaching 550 miles per hour, but that's where the problems began. The extra weight made it difficult to get off the ground, and by the late 1940s, the military had lost interest. Jet engines were now the future, and the awkward-looking propeller-driven Flying Pancake was obsolete before it ever saw combat. In 1947, the program was scrapped, and the only XF-5U1 prototype was destroyed. The V173, however, survived and is now on display at the Frontiers of Flight Museum in Dallas. It may not have changed the course of aviation, but it remains one of the most unique aircraft designs ever built, proof that sometimes even the strangest ideas can get off the ground, just like F-85 Goblin McDonnell X F-85 Goblin did. The McDonnell XF-85 Goblin was supposed to be the ultimate backup plan for bomber crews, a tiny parasite fighter designed to be carried inside a B-36 Peacemaker and deployed mid-air to defend against enemy aircraft. But as promising as it sounded on paper, reality had other ideas. Designed in the late 1940s, the Goblin was the Air Force's solution to a major problem. Their long-range bombers could fly deep into enemy territory, but escort fighters couldn't keep up for the entire trip. Instead of building a fighter with extreme range, engineers at McDonnell tried a different approach. Why not just pack a small, highly maneuverable jet inside the bomber itself? The Goblin was the result, a compact egg-shaped aircraft with stubby wings and a retractable hook for docking with its mothership. At just under 15 feet long, it was one of the smallest jet fighters ever built. It had no landing gear because it was never meant to take off or land like a normal plane. Instead, it would drop from the bomber's belly, engage enemy fighters, and then latch back onto the mothership before refueling and doing it all over again. In theory, it was an innovative idea. In practice, it was a disaster. During flight tests in 1948, pilots quickly discovered that reconnecting to the bomber in mid-air was nearly impossible. The Goblin bounced violently when attempting to hook onto its trapeze, making retrieval a dangerous challenge. challenge. On one test flight, turbulence slammed the aircraft into the docking gear, shattering its canopy and forcing the pilot to make an emergency belly landing. After multiple failed attempts, the Air Force realized that trying to dock a tiny fighter onto a moving bomber in combat conditions was asking for trouble. By 1949, the project was dead. Advances in air-to-air refueling made long-range escort fighters possible, eliminating the need for a parasite fighter. Only 2 Goblins were ever built, and they never saw operational service, but they're still remembered to this day for being some of the weirdest aircraft ever. Which one of these is your favorite?